This essay is from Gao Artai's autobiographical essay collection In Search of My Homeland. Gao Artai, a Chinese painter, was punished in the 1950s for publishing the article on beauty and underwent re-education through labor at the Jiabianguo labor camp. Emerging from Death recounts the author's experiences during the Great Leap Forward in 1959.
Emerging from Death. Written by Gao Artai. Translated by Robert Dorset and David Pollard. That dawn we gathered together as usual in the weak sunlight, preparing to set out for work. It was very cold, and I wrapped my padded coat tightly about me, pulled in my head, thrust my hands in my sleeves, and stamped my feet as I waited in the file. All of a sudden I heard a shout. "Gao Artai, step forward!" When I did so, Officer Hun came up to me, looked me up and down, and said, "Go back inside." I returned to my billet, lay down in my bed space, and cupping my head in my hands, looked at the speckled and flaking crust on the mud walls. Nothing went through my mind, either thoughts not fears. I did not know why I had been called out, but I knew that whatever happened to me, it couldn't be worse than my present state. Without intending to, I fell fast asleep. I was awakened to find two policemen standing behind the commander of the sub-farm. A military jeep was parked outside. They told me to get in. Immediately I was told to get out again and fetch my luggage. I bundled up my rags and tatters, together with lice and straw, and stuffed it any old how next to my seat. The two policemen sat in front. I sat behind. This seating arrangement seemed to me a good sign, but I did not build up my hopes. We drove across the huge Gobi, at times going like the wind, at other times bouncing up and down. It really was piercingly cold. I piled my rags over me and was lulled into sleep again. In my dreams I heard shots, which turned out to be my companions shooting at gazelles. They let off a whole volley, but missed. I slept fitfully for the rest of the journey. When El finally woke up, dusk was closing in, the sun a blur in the west. We were nearing a small town. The heating flues of a few mud-built farmhouses scattered through the outskirts were sending up thick smoke from the stubble and dried dung the farmers burned. The smoke did not ascend, it accumulated in long, drawn-out, heavy clouds over the countryside that gradually merged with the evening mist, making the mist smutty and giving it a charred smell. Showing through this murk was the purpling of the night sky. On the ground I could dimly make out tussocks of wild grass, rows of white poplars, and raised field borders buttressed by yellow sand. Though there wasn't a hint of verdure, I was deeply moved. Seeing these diverse signs of human life, I felt like a traveler coming home after a long stay away. Instead of driving on into the town, we turned into a big high-walled compound where police were standing guard. There were watchtowers and barbed wire on the walls, and a sign over the gate that read, Galtai Prison. Caught in the last rays of the sun, the watchtowers were rosy red on one side, deep blue on the other. We got out of the jeep in deep blue shadow and were ushered into a room by policemen dressed in deep blue uniforms. In this badly lit room a stove glowed red, coal smoke, and tobacco smoke filled the air, and the stuffy heat was laced with a musty smell. The police were obviously old comrades, judging by the boisterous way they laughed and talked. Someone brought hot water for washing hands and feet, including some for me, to my surprise. A sumptuous feast followed. A dozen people sat around the table, all public security men, both cadres and ordinary policemen. I was sandwiched between them. No one spoke to me. While they were playing drinking games, quaffing deeply, and talking at the top of their voices, I, half dead from hunger, tucked in by myself. Too impatient to chew the food, I swallowed big lumps of meat and boiled eggs practically whole. That night I couldn't sleep because of the awful pain in my swollen stomach. Galtai is a small station on the Lanzhou-Xinjiang line. On one side is the Qilian mountain range, on the other the Great Gobi. It is situated on an incline, which gives you distant views, but of a cheerless vista. We boarded a train here. It was not until I looked at the ticket that I knew the date was March 6, 1959, and we were heading east to Lanzhou. When I had been escorted westward over a year before, There was a diner and a sleeper car on the train, but this time there was neither. The car attendant distributed pancakes twice a day, one per person. They were cold and hard, and there was nothing to go with them, but passengers stretched out their hands for these pancakes with great eagerness, and held them as if they were treasures. I had been completely cut off from the world and hadn't an inkling that a nationwide famine had already begun. I was just aware that the atmosphere in the carriage was depressed, and that everyone looked gaunt and washed out. We arrived in Lanzhou on the morning of the third day. The 2 policemen took me to the public security department for Gansu province, handed me over to 2 civil policemen belonging to the office of the head of department, and left. These 2 civil policemen were quite amiable. One was called Don Lin, about 40, a history graduate from Lanzhou University. The other was Ding Xinghui, about 30, a graduate of the Law Department of Northwest Institute of Political Science and Law. They told me that as its contribution to the celebration of the first decade of the new China, the provincial committee had decided to stage an exhibition of the achievements of a decade of construction, and had built an exhibition center in the Qilihe district of Lanzhou, later to become the Gansu Provincial Museum. They needed some big oil paintings for it. My task was to complete these paintings by October 1st, when the exhibition would open. I asked what was to be painted and how big the paintings should be. They didn't know, someone there would tell me, they said. I have to warn you, Don Lin added. The provincial committee transferred you here on temporary assignment because of the work that needs to be done here. It doesn't mean you are released from re-education through labor. Even less does it mean your rightist tag is removed. There is a change in your work environment. There is no change in your status. The content of your work has changed. Its nature hasn't. If you remember that, it will be to your good. Ding Xinghui escorted me to Qilihe, handed me over to the exhibition planning office, and left. His parting words to me were, "The people here are all seconded from various bodies, and there's bound to be a lot of loose talk. You should be very careful what you say. At the same time, you've nothing to fear. Your relationship with anybody here is only a work relationship. Your sole organizational relationship is with us. If anybody wants to get at you, they have to go through us. We'll come and see you in a few days, and you can tell us if there's anything wrong." In the purely revolutionary lexical field of the time, these words of his, and Don Lin's too, fell strangely on the ear. They'd addressed me as a human being, not as a political sign. That wasn't the language an organization used toward an individual. Even less did it resemble the language used by an organ of brute force toward an object under its absolute control. There were no official formulas or jargon such as remote thought and redeem transgressions through merits. I was quite unused to hearing such a tone. Rather than being comforted, I was simply surprised. This was the first time in my life that I discovered, for me it was a discovery, that there could be humanity even in the Communist Party police force. I might add in passing that when I was arrested again 30 years later at Nanjing University, and interrogated in Chengdu, I found that several policemen acted with humanity, and had a sense of morality. Yet the language they used completely conformed to the norms of party culture. The mechanisms used for getting meaning across were much more convoluted. Difference between earlier and later is symbolic of historical change, but we can't go into that here. The planning office assigned me to stay in the Friendship Hotel across the street. This was a luxuriously appointed hotel for the exclusive accommodation of Soviet experts. It was the first time I had stayed in a luxury hotel. There I was, thin as a skeleton and with scarcely any clothes to my back, placed in the midst of thick carpets, big wall hangings, heavy plush curtains, and glittering chandeliers. It was really weird, as if something was out of joint. Actually, there was no mistake. The Soviet experts had all left because of the Sino-Soviet split, and the exhibition had taken over these rooms. All the paintings I had to do were to sing the praises of the great achievements of New China, most importantly the General Line, the Great Leap Forward, and the People's Communes. Millions of people going without sleep to combat nature, move mountains, and make lakes. Devotion to communal canteens as imperishable foundations, stupendous output, mountains of grain from a single acre, pigs as big as oxen, rustic blast furnaces blossoming all over and belching molten steel. All these great deeds that I was to highlight supposedly could not have been realized except under the leadership of the party and Chairman Mao. The paintings had to pass a series of inspections and reach the point of the leadership contented, the masses assenting, before they were judged finally acceptable. They brought me a big pile of pictorial magazines that were full of photographs on these subjects. Since the contents were formulaic and only required meshing together, it wouldn't be hard to complete my commission. The job would still be physical, nothing to do with art. The good thing was that the intensity of the labor would be a lot less than that demanded for digging drainage ditches. My problem was my health. At that time my upper body was so thin that my bones stuck out, while my legs were swollen like tree trunks. I desired nothing more all day than to lie down, and when I did lie down I couldn't get up again. I had to turn on my face and slowly lever myself up with my arms. The paintings were huge, and I needed help to get up and down the scaffolding. On top of that, I could not stand for long to paint and needed continually to sit down. Nevertheless, I gritted my teeth and summoned up my last reserves to stick it out. I knew that if I failed to satisfy, I would be sent back to Jiabiango, to certain death. When Don Lin said, "It will be to your good," that was the good in question. This was not about painting, it was about staying alive. The food in the hotel was high class, came in many varieties, and what's more, was not limited in quantity. I very soon got fat through overeating, in fact a lot fatter than at any other time in my life. But a body of blubber gave no relief from exhaustion. My legs still felt as heavy as lead, and my reactions were still slow. When I walked around I was not agile enough to avoid bumping into people coming from the opposite direction. I still could not get used to seeing other people going off to enjoy themselves, wondering where they got the energy. After 4 or 5 months, though, I started to lose weight, and then I continued to slim down until I reached the level I was at prior to being imprisoned. At long last I felt my energy and vitality were getting back to normal. I was no longer afraid of climbing stairs or going on long walks. I reacted more alertly when something cropped up. I went up and down the scaffolding with more ease. At the same time I began to take an interest in things that did not immediately concern me, like the starry sky, the sound of the river, or a kite circling high in the heavens. I became fond of bookshops, losing all sense of time looking around them. And I was often visited by sexual urges, not being able to sleep again after waking in the middle of the night. The work proceeded more and more smoothly. Having submitted various drafts for approval, I learned how to appeal to their tastes. Having heard much prating and attitudinizing, I learned how to play to the gallery. I even heard from the Public Security Department that I was acquitting myself very well. My painting titled Commune Members' Home was the best received. The subject was a canteen of a people's commune. The fish and meat on the table were crisp and swimming in oil. The faces of the men and women, oldsters and youngsters, were glowing with ruddy health, mouths gaped in wide smiles. Ironically, a great famine was spreading through the nation just at that time. My mind was fixed on producing results, my effort bent on making the details lifelike and the atmosphere jolly. It didn't occur to me that I was lying, that I was fueling the disaster by this pretense. No, occasionally it did occur to me, but it was no more than a fleeting thought that in no way affected my work. As October 1st, the day of completion of the assignment, got nearer and nearer, I became more and more worried. I hoped for the best, prepared for the worst. Every day I got up before dawn and went for a long run along the river, intending to get fit enough to stand up to another critical test. But the test did not come. After the exhibition opened, I was kept on to edit a picture album to commemorate the exhibition, and thus was allowed to stay in Lanzhou until the summer of 1960. By that time the Jiabiango farm was on the verge of extinction because too many people had died there, and, being left homeless, I was sent to another reform-through labor camp, the Jiahetain farm, in Jingyuan. The conditions of work and the natural environment there were both an improvement on Jiabiango, besides which, my health had recovered, so I was not dismayed. Looking back from the desolate countryside around Jiahetain, The luxury of the Lanzhou Friendship Hotel seemed like a dream. It came to me that in tandem with the resurrection of my physical body, my soul had actually advanced toward death. I had lost myself, become a pliant tool in others' hands, had become a thing. To be transformed into a thing was no different from being dead. The will to live drove me to write. Secretly, using minuscule characters, I wrote on whatever scraps of paper came to hand. As time went by, those scraps grew too many to keep on my person, and I had to find a hiding place for them. That was dangerous, but the risk had to be taken. In all my shuttling from place to place over the years, I have carried that ever-growing dangerous bundle with me. The bulk of the articles and books I published later had their source in that bundle. It was because it existed that I dared to believe. I had emerged from the shadow of death.
Why do I recommend Emerging from Death? As mentioned earlier, it's personally inspiring. It underscores the idea that life needs creation, which directly led to the inception of this channel. The author's journey of finding his way out of a dehumanizing existence through writing resonates with my quest to discover the meaning of my own life through design and creation. Another reason is its portrayal of life in a labor camp, highlighting the devastating impact of that era on people physically, mentally, and spiritually. Of course, these feelings are deeply tied to the entire book, In Search of My Homeland. Since my production pace is deliberate, I choose to work on my favorite articles, but I recommend reading the original for those interested. Please note that the English version differs significantly from the Chinese version, which includes more articles about the author's childhood. You mentioned the slow production process, but doesn't AI generate content instantly? I view generative AI more as a productivity tool. For example, I enjoy designing but lack drawing skills, so I can design a scene and let AI assist with the artwork. However, the final work remains a form of my personal expression. Since my goal isn't to make money from this endeavor, I can focus on the details and strive for perfection. The process may be slow, but it's enjoyable. It feels like crafting a piece of art while sharing values and beauty.